From the three GPUs that Nvidia announced for RTX 4000, you're going to want to avoid one specifically very heavily. I'm going to tell you why. The first RTX 4000 that we're going to see is going to be the 4090, but don't worry about that one for now. You're going to want to avoid the 4080 and not the 16 gigabyte one, specifically the 4080 12 gigabyte model. This is the one that Nvidia supposedly says is going to have an MSRP of $899. We see various problems with this. First, let's talk about what the 4080 12 gigabyte is and what it isn't. I really don't know why Nvidia is calling both of them the RTX 4080. I'm sure you guys have seen the jokes saying that it's supposed to be a 4070, and that's actually really true. AD 103 compared to AD 104, it should really be a 4070. The differences are pretty massive. Let's look at the 3080 12 gigabyte and the 3080 10 gigabyte from the last generation. Now, the 2 gigabyte of VRAM difference, sure, it's something, but aside from that, the GPUs really weren't that big of a difference. They were basically almost the same GPU. You could make an argument that the 12 gigabyte one is more of a cut down 3080 Ti, and the other one just a regular vanilla 3080. But now with the new 12 gigabyte 4080, there are many more significant differences. First, the VRAM, it's a bigger spread. It's going to be a 4 gigabyte difference. That's not really all that big of a deal, but a lot of people thought that 10 gigabytes of the original 3080 was definitely pushing it, not very future-proof at all. 12 gigabytes was like the minimum that people really wanted in a high-end GPU. 16, definitely where you want to be, in my opinion. 12 is still a little bit tight. If last generation 10 was sort of the bare minimum, I think this generation 12 is really pushing it as well. Of course, this is a GPU that you're going to want to use for 4K. I mean, it's a 4080 class GPU. This is not something you want to throw at 1080p necessarily, unless you're doing really high refresh rate, but 4K is definitely going to be where this GPU wants to be at, high resolution. So you definitely want more VRAM. 12 will be enough for most people, for most games, but certainly for the price that you're paying, would have been nice to have at least 16 gigabytes like we see in the much more expensive $1,200 16 gigabyte 4080. So that's another sign that this should have been an RTX 4070. The CUDA cores, fairly significant difference. We didn't see this amongst the other GPUs of last generation, but now you see there's a pretty wide spread between the CUDA cores of the RTX 4080 and the real 4080 16 gigabyte. So these are all the specs that are currently visible to us. Of course, there hasn't been any public testing in real games of these GPUs aside from the information that Nvidia gave. We can probably expect, based on these differences and the price difference, that down the line you're going to see many more limitations on this particular 4080, including its ability to actually do ray tracing to the same level of the other GPUs in the RTX 4000. So one big point, why would you want this GPU? Not really very many reasons there. Of course, you can make an argument why Nvidia wants this GPU on the market. They want to price something high, not a 4070. That would be way too competitive, especially in this market, if it has this type of performance for a much cheaper price. So at least if they slap on an RTX 4080 name, they could technically say it's an 80 class GPU and justify that price. Now, of course, Nvidia also has RTX 3000 to still worry about. That's its biggest competition at this point. AMD RDNA 3 hasn't been announced yet. That's going to be November 3rd. That's going to present another big issue for Nvidia. If they're really competitive, they could potentially destroy this GPU. The 4090, we don't know. That's going to be Nvidia's, highest end GPU, but this highly limited 4080 12 gigabyte, and by limited, I don't mean in availability, I mean in technically limited. This 4070 is really what it should be. Everybody's right with their jokes. This is going to be low-hanging fruit for AMD to come in and just smash it with something that's cheaper and performs considerably more, negating any type of advantage that Nvidia has with DLSS and things like that. AMD, of course, has their own versions as well. So aside from that, Nvidia's competition, RTX 3000, there have been some inklings of rumors already that even the 3090 Ti is likely to perform better in traditional rasterization than the 4080 12 gigabyte, which would leave it with very few incentives for people to actually want to upgrade upgrade to it. The only thing that Nvidia has going for this GPU is the new DLSS 3.0, and if your specific game really benefits from that, like maybe Flight Simulator, that it seems like it has a nice benefit, then maybe in those cases, maybe in games that you really want to use ray tracing, you may actually see a performance benefit out of the 4080 12GB compared to something that was last generation's best card, the 3090 Ti. But the 3090 Ti may actually start to come very close in price to this 4080, or even cheaper as time goes on and prices start to reduce even more. So if you get it cheap enough, 3090 Ti may actually be a better buy than this 4080, especially with twice the VRAM. The 3090 Ti is still available from EVGA, so if you like EVGA and you're sad they're going away, you still get a pretty cool cooler as well. That's going to be another point. Which third-party brands are going to carry this $899 4080 12GB? I don't think we're going to have a Founders Edition, which means that sort of Founders Edition price may not really be possible. A 4090 is $1599 MSRP Founders Edition, and technically some AIBs should have maybe the very base model, but we really didn't see these models very often at all during RTX 3000. That 4090 is more likely to be 17, 1800, maybe even over 2000 for a very high-end version. So the same thing is going to happen with sort of this 4080 12GB. If you don't have that Founders Edition to fall back on at $899, these AIBs are going to really increase these prices for as much as they can if the market dictates it. Of course, if there's not that great demand, they may have more incentive to keep it closer to $899, but we're not going to know that until they start to sort of sell these over time. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw the 4080 12GB for well over $1,000 from many AIB retailers, and that's not even sort of the scalper market price. That's just because they usually put at least $100 or more on top of their specialty coolers compared to the MSRP from Nvidia. We would hope the AIBs would at least provide a decent amount of different options at $899, but judging from what we've seen in the past, this may be a GPU that's not out there very much at all, and when it is a fairly high price, I would say maybe even getting closer to the $1199 price of the 16GB 4080, which after all is a much better GPU in terms of its technical merits. So judging from the specs and pricing that Nvidia have given us, it's obvious you should avoid the 12GB 4080. If you really want a 4080, it's going to be a best bet to go a little higher and get the 16GB model, even though it is very expensive and it starts to get out of everybody's budget. But at $900 4080, that's really supposed to be a 4070, isn't very budget friendly either. So you may want to wait for AMD to release RDNA 3 or see what's going on with the RTX 3000 market. You may be able to catch a 3090 Ti for significantly less than you would a 4080 12GB, and it may actually perform better for the games that you play depending on what it is. Of course, the 3090 Ti was terrible at $1,099 earlier this year. It's not even so great at $1,099, but if the prices keep going down further beneath the price of RTX 4000, it may actually not be a bad GPU. Nothing wrong with it as a piece of hardware, very performant. It's certainly a great GPU that's going to put up a good fight even against the RTX 4080, if not even beat this lower end model as we start to see different benchmarks and results come out. You have to remember, RTX 4000 is going to excel at the very specific games that Nvidia put up. It's going to be great at ray tracing, games that are very optimized for DLSS 3.0. Those are areas where it's going to have significantly more performance than the previous generation. But if it's a regular game that's not really optimized that much, it's not ray tracing, you're going to see a lot less of a performance uplift with RTX 3000 compared to the new RTX 4000. And then you have to look at the price, keep in mind what games you're playing, and that certainly is going to help you make a significantly better decision when you see the real world numbers come out in the next several weeks. But definitely the RTX 4080, something you really want to avoid, even though it's the cheapest RTX 4000 for now. It's not one you're going to want. Either you step up to the bigger versions, or you wait a little bit longer for pricing to go down, or for the real 4070 to actually be announced, and that way you may have a better chance at seeing something with an actual decent price to performance ratio. All right guys, so let me know what you think about this particular GPU. What's your plan? Are you going to wait to see what else comes out, or are you jumping on one of the two other high-end RTX 4000 models? All right, remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.